Everyone, let me take a moment. I know many of you know us, but I'd like you to just, if you don't, if this is one of your the first times that you're joining or the first time, let me tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do. The Survive and Thrive Advocacy Center, or STAC, is here in Florida's Panhandle. We serve an area in the Big Bend area, as we call it, and really we're located here. We started these third Friday trainings a number of years ago to really do what I think all of us need to do, which is help the communities that we're in understand what trafficking is and, very importantly, what it isn't. There's so much myth and misinformation about trafficking. We really, I think we all have a kind of obligation to get the word out and to really ground ourselves on the realities of what human trafficking survivors go through, have gone through, and what they want us to know. As such, we have been working for the last over a decade on assisting both survivors of sex and labor trafficking, adults and minors, people regardless of immigration status. We are here for anyone who has been trafficked or who is at risk. So we do a lot of technical assistance and the like on the ground, as well as on the online and on the phone. We provide care management. Graciela Marquina, who is one of our advocates, is on this webinar. I just saw you come in here. Hello, Graciela. And we also have a new advocate, Misha Allen, who is working with Graciela to assist survivors. We do a lot of work in this area, from providing housing and other kinds of basic necessity support, and things that you don't often think of, like we'll help somebody with a car payment if it will, help them stay employed or in school. And we do, as you know, survivors' needs are very unique. And so we work closely with survivors to really help them to be safe and to move forward. The only way we do this, of course, is to work with partners in our community. And that's everyone from our healthcare community to law enforcement to DCF to many different agencies and the faith community. We're doing lots of work in rural areas now, and I'm really, really happy and I don't know if we have anyone from our rural surrounding areas, but we are so grateful, because that's one of the myths that's out there, that human trafficking doesn't happen in rural areas, but we know, of course, it does. The community education piece is big, and I'll put something in the chat later, but know that this webinar is being recorded. It will be available on our website afterwards. You'll get a certificate today, as Lisa just described, because you're attending live. But if you are watching this after the fact, then STAC will issue you an attendance certificate. And a lot of people, agencies, professionals use these as the professional development and the like, as they should, if I do say so myself, because all of these webinars, I will tell you, we don't do human trafficking 101. We know you can get that in a lot of places, and many of you have had that education. But we really seek to focus on issues that don't have the light shown on them, like it's Friday, like it should be. So anyway, thank you all for joining. We've had I think almost 500 people register for this event, and we see people are still joining, so that's great. Okay, next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, our website is here. When you go on the website, you just need to go under resources, and you'll see all of our past webinars, by the way. And we've had people watch these, and I've gotten requests for 5 certificates. So please know you can do that. We'll be putting the PowerPoint. I know some of you will say, how can I get the PowerPoint? The PowerPoint will be adjacent to the actual webinar recording when we go and post all that up. Give us about a week to do that. Also know that we provide this and all of our services free of charge. You'll see a lot of good info on our website. So that's our website. And I know many of you found out about this because you get our newsletters, you get our reminders. I promise you, if you get 3 emails a month from us, that's the standard. Maybe a little bit more at the end of the year, maybe a little bit more in January when we have Human Trafficking Prevention Month. So, but it's not a deluge of emails for you. But please go ahead and go on our website if you haven't. Please sign up for our newsletter. Awesome training, says Graciela. If you again, if you do say so yourself. Next page, please. We also have a podcast. We only talk with survivors of trafficking, and these are people who have gone through, who are the true experts about this issue of trafficking. This is not a time where we talk about stories that are exploitative in any way that really we don't even it's not even important for survivors to talk about exactly what happened to them. What they are telling us is what they want us to know as service providers, as people in the community, as family members, so that we can help other people. So know that these podcasts, if you're a podcast person, go ahead and subscribe, rate, and review, as they say. But we really encourage you to learn from survivors with us. Next slide, please. All right. So I don't know how it is in your hometown where you are. And Katie Papke, thank you for joining us and saying that about the podcast. You are on our podcast and our webinars. Um, we are facing a lot of uncertainty, to put it mildly, in our community as a nonprofit. We are seeing that the nonprofit agencies around us are suffering. We are seeing greater vulnerabilities of many. And we know that the only way we do this work is in a community and with our village. So if you are able to, if your agency is able to support our work, this work, you have the opportunity to opt in and donate $20, $5, whatever, every time you have a webinar viewing. Please feel free to do that. And I can't tell you how much it helps. And we also, as probably if you are in a nonprofit, you're probably learning too that it's important to have monthly donations. So if you can do it, we would be forever grateful for you to support our work. Next slide, please. Okay, today we're talking about trauma and trauma bonding. And I will say that this definitely touches on what, some of the myths and mythology that's out there about trafficking survivors. Will this issue of trauma bonding is one that comes up all the time. It is one that Dr. Joan Reed has been working on for literally decades, and I think we spoke way back when it was we were talking about survivors of domestic violence and some of the trauma bonding issues that go on. You have expertise there. Dr. Reed is also just one of our state's leaders in the anti-trafficking movement, as she heads up the USF Trafficking in Persons Research Lab. If you haven't seen the most recent report on trafficking in Florida, I really commend that to you. That is another webinar, by the way, that's on our website, where Dr. Reed and her team presented in August. You're going to talk more about your expertise. I'm just going to say, Dr. Reed, thank you so much for all you've done in the field forever, and for your being with us today, because this is one of those vitally important issues. We see that all the time. We also understand how people who are trafficked together also bond with each other, which we talked about as another aspect of this. So thank you. Cladis Bilali, I just met you, Cladis, and it's a delight to know you and to know of your work. Tons and tons of clinical work that you have done, and I loved seeing in your bio, which all of you can see there and see on our website, all the work you've done and how we know that it kind of transfers and translates between fields. One victimization is not necessarily completely different. It can be different, but there's tons of overlap between people who suffer trauma. All right, turning it over to you now, Dr. Reed and Cladis, and thank you again.
Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction, Robin, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk about trauma bonding. It has been a topic that I've been interested in researching and researched for probably, you're right, about 20 years. I actually was working in the field as a licensed mental health counselor, and talked with people about trafficking way, back in the early 2000s. And trauma bonding came up at that point. And that's actually why I went back and got my PhD, was in order to be able to research this topic, because I felt like it was so important to understand. So today we're going to take a deep dive into the complex issue of trauma bonding and the challenges that of its impact on those who are exploited in human trafficking. So we got a really nice introduction, but I'll tell you um, a little bit about my colleague here. So Cletus has her master's in clinical psych, and she's working on her PhD in criminology, and she has really extensive experience working with trafficked youth around trauma bonding. So I'm just so pleased that we both found this topic to be very interesting and we're able to present together today. So as Robin mentioned, we are going to cover topics that can be triggering or emotionally challenging. So if you feel like you need to step away from this content, please, take a break and come back when you can. So the topic today, we have it broken down into 4 modules, and fortunately, you won't have to hear from me the whole time. So I'm going to take module 1, which is what is trauma bonding, and then Cletus is going to talk about the theoretical insights and some current research around trauma bonding. I will then kind of take a deeper dive into trauma bonding and human trafficking, and then Cletus will finish up our presentation with strategies that possibly could be useful in working with those that have trauma bonding. So module 1, we can move on. What is trauma bonding? So trauma bonding is as a paradoxical psychological phenomena that's of victims of various types of interpersonal violence developing some kind of positive attachment to their abuser or captor. And it's been explained really as a product of interpersonal trauma. It's been called the super glue of sex trafficking, because the trauma bonds can psychologically inhibit a person from getting out of the situation, escaping an abusive situation, or create this destructive cycle of repeated or ongoing exploitation that we often see in human trafficking. So the most popular or propagated term around trauma bonding is Stockholm Syndrome. And I don't know how many of you know the history of that term, but it dates back to a bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden in 1973 that developed into a hostage situation. And the hostage situation lasted for 6 days. And during that time, the hostages began to develop a positive attachment to the robbers. After the ordeal ended and they all got out of that situation, they all survived. The hostages actually posted bail for the robbers and expressed wishes to marry them. They made jailhouse visits to the robbers, and actually, when they did finish their prison sentence, several of the hostages actually married the women that had been taken hostage during the bank robbery. So because of this situation and the misunderstanding and lack of understanding, this term was coined Stockholm Syndrome. So as I mentioned, historically, this phenomena of victims developing trauma bonding to their abuser or captors, it's been observed in very many forms of abusive relationships. Robin mentioned earlier intimate partner violence. It's also been observed with child sexual abuse, hostage taking, in cults, and in sex trafficking. And researchers and practitioners alike have documented this phenomena, but they've labeled it differently. So I think some of the confusion about it is it's been there. Each of those have a different term. We call it battered woman syndrome, or we call it child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. And so they all have different terms, but you're really looking at the same phenomena. So it's It's rooted in interpersonal crime, which is defined as an intentional act of physical, sexual, or psychological harm or power used against another person. And the dynamics between the humans involved in interpersonal violence can be very complex, and trauma bonding is no exception. So while the circumstances may differ a little bit, and it's super interesting, I did recently publish a book on trauma bonding. So if you're, and each chapter covers like trauma bonding in a different form of interpersonal violence. Or so if you want to dive deeper into those differences, because each one of them is a little different, they all share the conditions that create a trauma bond and a response in those who are experiencing the trauma bond. So, for a trauma bond to form, there's really two essential items. One is that there needs to be a power imbalance between the victim and the trafficker. And then the other necessary item is escalating violence or abuse that's interspersed with kind of pseudo supportive or neutral interactions. Another component we often see is social isolation and perceived powerlessness. One of the first terms that was ever used related to trauma bonding is brainwashing. And so it's kind of interesting or critical to understand what that means. And brainwashing has been defined as the deliberate creation of culture shock through isolation, alienation, and intimidation in order to weaken a person's ego strength. So, as that conditions of isolation, alienation, intimidation occur, the person becomes vulnerable to unusual ideas and behaviors that they formerly rejected. And so that term brainwashing was first used in conjunction with American prisoners of war, and to explain how US soldiers converted to communism while they were in captivity. And we can see in cult systems that that's very common, that the first thing they do is to attack the central elements of the self, including their worldview, their ego strength, their social interaction, and results in a repression of the pre-cult identity of the group members. And there's at some point, there comes a time in the process when the individual can no longer tolerate this cognitive dissidence, and that they begin to identify with the aggressor, and a new cult identity is superimposed. So you can see, there are groups, cultish groups. I'm sure you've read about NXIVM that masquerade as legitimate organizations, but they often offer self-help classes of all things. But they actually are breaking down the people who participate. So that is super important for us to know, what does trauma bonding look like? What are we going to, how will we know if somebody that we're working with or interacting with is experiencing a trauma bond? And what are some of the red flags, indicators of trauma bonding? And how does it appear to the outside observer? And Judith Herman, I'm sure many of you have heard of her. She describes it that a person who's experiencing a trauma bond will appear to be a willing victim to those who are untrained and really don't understand trauma bonding. And so practitioners, first responders, law enforcement, victim advocates, child protective investigators, all of us, right, that work with those that have been in interpersonal violent relationships, report a lot of confusion over this paradoxical response of victims of human trafficking toward others who attempt to assist them and want to help them exit the abuse or exploitive circumstances. So, for example, victims of sex trafficking are often unwilling witnesses, and that can be for many reasons. One reason can be a trauma bond. They could just be terrified, right? So trauma bond doesn't explain everything about being uncooperative, but it can be driving some of that. So they can be uncooperative with law enforcement, distrustful of service providers, to the point where they're not willing to even name the abuser. So criminal justice professionals, from law enforcement personnel to prosecutors, regard an uncooperative victim as one of the biggest barriers to identifying and prosecuting abusers. when the victim's uncooperative with law enforcement and compliant with the trafficker due to trauma bonding, those first responders, many of us can mistake that for a consensual or non-abusive relationship. However, a terrorized or traumatized individual with a trauma bond to the abuser may appear as compliant with the demands, not forced or coerced. And in relationship to human trafficking, I found a great quote around that where it's described, how difficult it is to detect force, fraud, and coercion. And you recognize those terms, right? Force, fraud, or coercion, and how difficult they are to identify in human trafficking because trafficked individuals have been brutalized with rape, with violence, passed from trafficker to trafficker, sold again and again. And the quote says, these women often are broken by the force that's been used against them, and it would be a grave injustice to mistake their submission for consent. So, how can this chart can really gives you kind of a list of just different red flag indicators of trauma bonding. I'm sure many of you have seen this in your work. So, defending or protecting the abuser, returning to the abuser seemingly voluntarily, being extremely loyal and defensive, minimizing and denying the abuse, seeking approval from the abuser, difficulty trusting others, and then the way that the psychological issues or cognitive, their thoughts are to internalize the blame, make it all about them. Belief that they have some kind of special relationship with the abuser. The person is their soulmate. They've never met anyone like them. And I'm using the term he, but it could be a she. Confusion around love and harm, feeling indebted, distorted sense of normalcy. What's normal in a relationship can really be warped. And then emotionally, we talked about that. There's a lot of guilt and shame, huge fears around being abandoned. Numbness and dissociation are typical, anxiety and distress when they're being separated, and feeling incapable or unworthy of healthy love. So those are some red flag indicators that hopefully you'll get a copy of these slides, and they'll be helpful for you as you work in this field. So, and I also want to mention that there's also, you have to think about it in terms of the long-term effects of trauma bonding, and how trauma bonding is kind of like one layer of what's happened, and that there's also these other emotional distress, confusion, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety. So there's long-term effects of trauma bonds that really go on until the person really comes to form an understanding of what's happened to them and begin to create new healthy ways of relating to people. So at this point, I'm going to pass it on over to Cletus, and she's going to talk to us about some theoretical insights.
Yeah, so trauma bonding in the context of human trafficking is under research relative to other forms of interpersonal violence, such as intimate partner abuse. Often we tend to hyper-focus on symptoms or indicators rather than strong theoretical causal frameworks, which can be problematic when we work to identify trauma bonding in the context of human trafficking and other types of crime. So we do need causal theoretical models to help us explain how trauma bonding is actually happening, to really understand the mechanisms that are driving this process. Currently, there are several key theories of trauma bonding in the context of human trafficking, which have garnered pretty significant attention and show strong potential as causal models or explanations of trauma bonding. Specifically, we're going to focus on attachment theory, child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, and one key neurological explanation. Neurological explanations of coerced attachments don't comprise a cohesive theory per se, but do provide a general understanding of why at the neurological or physiological level, victims become attached to their abusers. So the first theory we're covering is attachment theory. Many of you might be familiar with this theory, but when we talk about attachment theory, we generally think about two waves of research. So first, the work of Bowlby and Ainsworth, who pioneered attachment theory, and the work of psychologist Bartholomew Horowitz in the early 90s, who expanded the theory and applied it to adult relationships. So, attachment theory proposes that the relationship a child shares with their caregivers is crucial. In fact, they argue that it is the most important relationship to a child's life. Bowlby and Ainsworth proposed that this relationship is quite fragile, though important, such that when a parent does not properly respond to the needs of the child, this in turn impacts the attachment between the parent and the child. Bowlby and Ainsworth did propose three main attachment styles or patterns between children and their caregivers, and they kind of split them up between secure and insecure attachment styles. So first, we have more securely attached kids. These are the kids with warm, responsive caregiving, children who are granted enough freedom and autonomy to explore, but there's also trust in the relationship between them and their parents, such that parents are properly responding to the needs of the child. Then we have more insecure attachment styles. So for insecure avoidant kids, these are the kids with more dismissive caregivers who tend to condition a more self-reliant child. These are parents that really struggle to respond to the needs of their kids. And unfortunately, some recent research has indicated that these are the kids that do tend to become so independent to the point where you have this adultification or parentification kind of process wherein the child actually ends up taking on the role of the responsive caregiver rather than the parent. And finally, insecure ambivalent. And these are the kids with caregivers who are pretty inconsistent in their responsiveness to the child's needs. Sometimes caregivers will respond properly, other times they will reject or be dismissive of the child's needs. Among these children, this attachment style presents as clinginess. You might have a child that will do anything to get their parents' attention. So we do see a lot of connection seeking among these youth. And then so taking that on in the early 90s, Bartholomew and Horowitz found that we can take this a step further and proposed how these early attachment styles actually impact adult relationships that these kids will share with their romantic partners or friends. They propose four primary attachment styles. So secure, this is pretty similar to Bowlby's and Ainsworth theory, but secure partners are comfortable with intimacy and autonomy. They're not afraid to get close to their partners, but they also value their independence, so there's some balance there. You also have preoccupied or anxiously attached partners who may be overly fixated on relationships, and they often tend to fear abandonment. So they will do anything to preserve these relationships, even remaining in relationships that may be unhealthy, which is where we start to see some of the overlap between anxious attachment and trauma bonding, especially when you throw in trauma and violence and abuse. And then we see dismissing or avoidant partners who really try to avoid closeness as much as possible and are highly, highly independent. This does not necessarily mean that they don't want to be in a relationship or don't want that intimacy, but they tend to have a really hard time being more vulnerable and opening themselves up to others. And we do know certainly a lot of human trafficking victims who have been through a lot of abuse can kind of swing either way, right? They can become highly anxious or more avoidant and distrustful of close relationships. They also proposed a fourth attachment style, fearful. These are the individuals that crave relationships but fear intimacy so much that they may become socially avoidant. So it's kind of like a mix between anxious and avoidant, those types of styles. The most important takeaway from this theory is that they are malleable, that just because a child was born into a family or family dynamics that led to them being more anxious or avoidant, it doesn't mean that they will always be anxious or avoidant. Theoretically, being in a relationship with a healthy partner can help people move towards a more secure orientation, attachment orientation, which is why interventions in therapy is so important. Attachment theory is crucial in the context of human trafficking, and interpersonal violence more broadly, because it does help us understand why people become overly dependent on their abuser and kind of help us predict future victimization or re-victimization. For example, the pathway between family trafficking to the involvement in the commercial sex industry and exploitation in adulthood. I've linked here a book recommendation called Attached. This is a book by two relationship experts. I often recommend it to my patients who have a lot of questions regarding attachment theory and how traumatic early life experiences have impacted them in adulthood. The second theory is child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, and this was proposed by a psychiatrist in the early 80s, Dr. Summit. He published this really great paper in 1983 where he proposed CSAS as a tool to help practitioners understand and conceptualize why victims of child sexual abuse remain silent about the abuse, recant allegations, or continue to have relationships with abusers despite abuse happening, the severity of the abuse. So in other words, it was attempting to explain some of the paradoxical behaviors that were demonstrated by his patients. He proposed 5 key proponents through this theory. The first being secrecy. So he proposed that victims are coerced into silence. He argued that victims are entirely dependent on their abusers for whatever reality is assigned to their experience. Victims are often dissuaded, threatened, intimidated, or forced not to disclose abuse to others, which confines them to the abusive conditions, which the child may grow to perceive as unescapable. This in turn leads to helplessness, so children may feel powerless against adults, especially their adult abuser. He argues that children are considered subordinate to their adults, to other adults and their abuser. And there's also an expectation that children must remain obedient, regardless of the circumstances kind of going on. So according to him, a silenced child is overcome by a sense of helplessness, and their attempts to escape abuse are thwarted by the fact that child abusers often present themselves as trusting and hardworking and otherwise law-abiding people, which is what makes it so difficult for non-offending caregivers to come to terms with the fact that the child abuser ever perpetrated sexual violence against a child. This in turn leads to entrapment and accommodation, which is really where we see the trauma bonding part kind of coming in. Victims begin to adapt to the abuse and violence going on. Summit argues that when a child victim is not immediately recovered and protected and believed when they disclose abuse, they may perceive the abuse as inescapable and will begin to employ what he calls accommodating mechanisms to cope, right? Trying to survive in a really coercive context. He reports that mechanisms might manifest in really strange behaviors, like the child not fighting the abuser, or on the opposite side of things, the child might lash out, run away, become quote unquote delinquent to the eyes of somebody who doesn't know what's really going on. Summit also argues that these are all indicators that these are the child's attempts to maintain some extent of control in these coercive relationships. And it really is what pushes them to delay disclosure, or if they do disclose, to perhaps have some difficulty in recalling some information as related to their abuse. He proposes that disclosures may be more likely to occur during adolescence when victims grow mature enough to demand and pursue greater independence, when they have perhaps healthier relationships with their peers or other family members. But he does note that some victims never disclose, and when they do, it's so critical for people in their life to take these allegations seriously and to ensure that they are being recovered as soon as possible. Some victims do wait years before disclosing, and unfortunately, Summit theorizes that the longer that victims wait, or the longer that it takes to intervene, the more likely that these allegations are to be met with disbelief, which ultimately leads to retraction. So when victims again are not believed or immediately recovered, they begin to retract a lot of those allegations or minimize the abuse, and this whole cycle is in turn reinforced. So evidently, CSAS does provide a more parsimonious theory for some of the strange or paradoxical victim behaviors as a response to abnormal conditions. He would argue that These strange behaviors are a child's attempts to survive. So theoretically, anybody who's kind of experiencing these conditions is likely to respond in a similar way. Certainly, it also depends on protective factors and all of that, but irrespective of personality or intelligence or other individual factors, theoretically, these conditions are what cause a child to demonstrate these accommodating behaviors. There are some notable controversies to highlight here with this theory. However, its use in court has been widely criticized, and this is something we cover in Dr. Reed's book on trauma bonding and the law. There's a chapter on this, but unfortunately, the theory was misused by some legal practitioners as a diagnostic tool to make a determinate finding that the child was being abused, which is not really how Summit proposed the theory or its intended use. He did come out with another paper in the early 90s kind of criticizing people that were misusing it, but unfortunately did lead to a lot of unfortunate consequences. Like there was a number of people in the field that didn't consider Stockholm Syndrome and trauma bonding a real thing and they use these court cases where people were falsely accused of child sexual abuse because they were only using this theory and no other corroborating evidence to support their claims of child sexual abuse. So it goes to show why it's so important to bridge research and practice and to be very clear on our part as researchers about the intended use of a lot of the measures and tools that we put out there. And finally, there are a number of neurological perspectives that can help explain some of the paradoxical behaviors of victims in interpersonal crime. We've just mentioned one here in the interest of time, but it's one that has received quite a bit of empirical research. One of these explanations points to a hyperactive amygdala, which is part of the brain that processes strong adverse emotions like fear, among other functions. It's proposed that because the amygdala is constantly active, when a victim is experiencing unrelenting trauma, abuse, and violence, the victim is conditioned to be in that fight or flight mode nonstop. So their sympathetic nervous system is always active as a means of survival. When danger is present, we know that our brains have this fight or flight reaction, right? We know why it's happening. We're responding to an active threat. But where we see that trauma bonding is happening is when victims are recovered and despite not being in active danger anymore, they're still responding with this fight, flight, freeze, fawn behavior. They're still minimizing the abuse, or they still have a sense of wanting to return and to their trafficker or return to the lifestyle. So the reason for this might be because the hyperactive amygdala is overriding a lot of the executive functions of the prefrontal cortices. So the parts of the brain that deal with things like rational decision making, impulse control, proper emotion regulation, exercising adequate judgment about situations, people's intentions. So it's presumed that this leads to heightened fear of leaving abusers, even when escape is possible, even when we offer them resources or services. Misperceptions of threat, we of course see that among trafficking victims of violence, where the victim perceives that leaving their abusive partner or their trafficker is considered more dangerous than remaining in that relationship. Essentially, this process leads to the development of learned helplessness, which we see a lot in the domestic violence literature, or an amygdala hijack, where the victim is, again, in constant fight or flight mode, even when they're recovered. I included a picture here of a beaten down path to kind of exemplify this process. So if you've ever been on a farm where animals are released to graze on grass, they start to take the path that's already beaten down as opposed to just creating a whole new path because it's easier. So in the same vein, these fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses that victims demonstrate are in a strange way perceived to be an easier way to cope with abnormal conditions that are marked by abuse and violence. Okay, and
So we're going to move into talking about trauma bonding, specifically in the context of human trafficking, and we're going to share, some of the research we've actually done together on this topic, really just kind of illustrating where trauma bonding and what the conditions within human trafficking are that create that trauma bonding. And you all know this probably by heart, the TVPA and the definition. And it's just, we highlighted the words here, force, fraud, or coercion, because those are typical conditions of human trafficking, and also they're conditions of trauma bonding. So when we talk about the process of exploitation, there's been quite a great there's a pretty good body of literature that talks about this process of exploitation. Maybe about 10 years ago, some research came out of the UK, and then we replicated it. And this is typically how traffickers work. They begin with recruiting. They go where potential victims are. They visit areas and find youth who are vulnerable, maybe bus stops or schools or different areas. And they look for those youth who are socially isolated, who they think they could be easy to manipulate. Possibly it's just because they're young and they're easier to manipulate. Sometimes traffickers, I know this was in some of my earliest research, it was a bit terrifying when we learned that traffickers use other girls and to recruit. I think that was kind of a new thought for us back, 10, 15 years ago, that it's very clever, because how do you influence an adolescent? The best way is through their peers. And so they use a lot of peer recruiting. And then they move on toward grooming, gifts and affection. Gradually, they desensitize them. And if we talk about the Jeffrey Epstein case, we know that Maxwell was used to recruit and to get girls by tempting them with glamorous jobs or trips to Jeffrey's island. And once she earned that girl's trust, she would invite them to meet Jeffrey, and then they were eventually be sexually exploited. And their trafficking ring, as you know, grew so big that they would end up enlisting victims to find other victims for Jeffrey. And in the end, they victimized hundreds of girls and women. Many of them were minors. And so, they began this grooming process of, sometimes it's called love bombing, where they shower with gifts and attention and affection, make promises to advance their career. And then the next step is really kind of a desensitization to commercial sex, maybe exposing them to pornography or commercial sex, with watching commercial sex happen with other people. And it begins to desensitize the potential, the victim that's being groomed, to kind of normalize these behaviors and to decrease their resistance to eventually being exploited. So during this time, the victim's perception of love, trust, normalcy in relationships becomes very warped. The dependency gradually increases on the abuser, and it eventually, escalates to the point where the victim is outright subjected to physical and sexual violence. Once that happens, it's the next step is that they become really entrapped in that situation. They can be, to the point where they're threatened with extreme types of violence. And at that point, there's really no limit to what a trafficker will do to a victim in order to entrap them and to exploit them. So let's look at some of the specific situations within human trafficking. A lot of this research came from case files in Florida. I've probably reviewed hundreds between Cletus and I all over the state. And so, they began with isolation and dependence, cut off their support system, move them from one section of the state where, move them down to Miami, where they have no idea where they are or what's going on. And so they become in any way to create that dependency. And then they began to reinforce self-blame, normalize abuse. Also, there's this intermittent cruelty and kindness that happens, kind of creating this false hope, and exploit their past trauma. They use fear, threats to shame and blackmail them. It puts, as if you think about what Cletus just shared about the neurological reaction to to harm and threats. And so they're just in this constant state of fear and reaction. There's also physical and sexual abuse. They also try to change their who they are by tattooing, branding, control their appearance, and destroy their documents and force new beliefs. And at that point, they've really destroyed their self-esteem and convinced the victim that they have no escape, and promote this feeling that this is my fault and I can't get out of the situation. So I think I'm telling you anything new if you've been working in the field. These are typical trafficker tactics. And it was interesting. Cletus and I did some research looking at different types of traffickers. And so we looked across the different forms whether it was a organized crime, kind of a gang situation, or a family abuser, or a con man, a romantic kind of con man. You can kind of see the labels we gave to the different traffickers that we found in the case notes. And the interesting thing is there are differences across how their tactics, but in the end, they overlap. They find these victims in places where they're vulnerable. They implement these grooming tactics that we just discussed, and then they ensnare them. And so it's interesting, regardless of the type of trafficker, whether it's they're using romance or acquaintance, peer, or it's a drug gang, they all kind of use these same tactics in order to entrap their victims. So what does trauma bonding look like in the context of human trafficking? And I'll just kind of give you a case with this, which I've changed to protect the victim's identity. But I did work with a woman who, it's interesting, what Cletus mentioned earlier about attachment. She witnessed severe intimate partner violence during her childhood. And then as she, got into close to adult age, she met the person as a boyfriend that eventually became her trafficker. But the first thing that he became was her batterer. And so this was definitely a case where intimate partner violence began first. For years, it was not like a short relationship. She was with him for many years, and he used every kind of if you've ever seen that domestic violence wheel where they have all the different things that a trafficker or batterer does, he did them all, from threatening her parents, like literally like throwing rocks through their windows and threatening to kill them. So he had raised fighting dogs. He would put the dogs on her. I mean, just everything you can imagine he did to her, prior to kind of pushing her into trafficking. And so at that point, she was already really trauma bonded to this person before the trafficking even actually began. I worked with her really, really short term, but it was interesting. She if you've worked with people with the trauma bond, what you'll often see is, with tears in their eyes, they will tell you, I know this person is going to kill me, but they're my soulmate and I can't live without them. So when you start seeing that, that's kind of that complex, crazy, paradoxical comments. I know they're going to kill me, but I can't live without them. They're my soulmate. I'll never meet anyone like them again. So that I'll just tell you one quick kind of how our relationship, it didn't end in a bad way at all, but as I was wrapping up my work with her, I had just read all these theories of trauma bonding, what couple of the ones that Cletus mentioned, but I was reading some evolutionary theories, and the person that was writing about it had mentioned that trauma bonding occurs with animals. And so I was trying to kind of talk to her about this situation. And I was like, this can even happen with animals. And at the time as a counselor, I'm like, oh, I probably shouldn't have said that. Maybe that was degrading. But it was her aha moment, because she remembered that he raised fighting dogs, and the most abused dogs were the most loyal. And it really pulled her out of that situation. It kind of broke not that she didn't have these intense feelings, but cognitively, like she understood at that point that she had been abused, and that was what was driving those feelings of loyalty and closeness. And so that's I'll pass it on now to Cletus, and she'll share with us some resources and strategies.
There are a number of challenges of recovery, and I'm sure you can you've kind of experienced this with your own clients and patients. But some challenges that we've noted here include the reluctance to self-identify as a victim of crime, which is quite interesting to me as a researcher, because if you have somebody that was robbed, most people would identify as a victim of crime, but for some reason, when the perpetrator is someone that we love or care about or we trust, we are somehow less inclined to believe that the abuse or violence makes us a victim of crime, especially when we share some type of attachment with the offender. So certainly, I mean, I've had so many clients that just really struggle to understand that what has happened to them is a crime. We also see confusion regarding the appropriateness of sexual and intimate behaviors. From a trauma-informed lens, we know that this is a result of the trauma and abuse that has happened to them. So, some victims of human trafficking, they are able to recognize what went wrong in those relationships and try to prevent re-victimization. But there are also instances where victims really have a lot of trouble recognizing how they can attain or maintain healthy, equitable relationships, right? Romantic relationships with their parents, relationships with their friends. Again, I've had a number of clients who have been in so many toxic relationships that when they finally got into a healthy relationship, they would disclose feeling very bored because they didn't have that constant heightened adrenaline as they did in a previous relationship. So part of our work together has been reframing what it means to be in a healthy, safe relationship, really defining what it means to be in a safe relationship with a safe partner. Of course, we've discussed trauma bonding ad nauseum today, but certainly, again, loyalty to a trafficker, pimp, and abuser. Interestingly, many victims also strongly identify with the life. For many victims, this is all they've ever known. I have had a number of patients that are also dealing with a lot of structural challenges like poverty and difficulty accessing resources, or who have had close family members survive in these difficult contexts for generations. So again, some of these victims might perceive these conditions as normal, or to some extent, or there's others that perceive the life as, again, this high adrenaline lifestyle that sometimes overshadows a lot of the violence and exploitation that they experience. This is probably why we see trauma bonding emerging even between some victims of trafficking who are experiencing similar traumas, or are experiencing the same structural difficulties. This is very distinct from social support. I think that's really important to highlight because this trauma bond between victims seems to be pulling victims back into the life, right? It's a negative thing rather than serving both the victims in a way out of trafficking, or supporting them through their journeys to a post-trafficking sort of lifestyle. So it's very distinct from social support, which is what we see in survivor mentorship programs, and how important we recognize that those relationships need to be leveraged in treatment. And of course, traffickers or abusers' relationship to the victims' families. So this is something that a number of my victims, my clients will report. Leaving a trafficker is challenging because terminating those relationships may also mean terminating relationships with their family members, other people beyond the relationship who perhaps might also feel a sense of loyalty or obligation to the trafficker, or be related to the trafficker, or who may not believe the victim's disclosure of abuse or exploitation. So I think sometimes it's hard for some practitioners to see that the decision to leave really isn't very easy, because there's so many people that are kind of involved in either the victim's exploitation or who are somehow tied to the trafficker. So that decision, it seems to be always pretty difficult for a lot of trafficking victims. And of course, lack of trust in law enforcement, us as providers in the CJ system. It might be that they've had bad experiences with some practitioner in the system. Often what is the case also is that having any sort of faith or trust with people associated with the system is a direct violation of the beliefs that traffickers and abusers have indoctrinated their victims with. So just reaching out, reporting, or disclosing, or taking advantage of services in and of itself is in violation of the things that the traffickers have conditioned these victims with. Generally, law enforcement will be the first to respond to victim recovery, and unfortunately, they are also the most likely to endure the most victim resistance. We've cited a interviewing guide here by the International Association of Chief of Police because it's a pretty good structured interviewing guide that takes more of a trauma-informed approach to asking questions, especially when you're conducting a forensic interview with survivors of sexual violence. So it's a good one if you're looking to adopt into interviews with victims of human trafficking as well. We've noted some interesting and important kind of tips and tricks here about interviewing trafficking victims or trying to gain a little bit more information from them in their recovery process. So using non-judgment for quote unquote strange victim behavior, recognizing that victim defiance is a result of trauma, parroting some language used by the victim, right? If they're referring to their trafficker as their boyfriend or a girlfriend, just kind of rolling with the punches as you develop that trust and rapport. Reflecting thoughts and feelings, which is a technique we often use in therapy, as a means of connecting with victims and helping them recognize that there's no judgment from us as you're kind of disclosing these behaviors that might seem extreme or might be very, again, paradoxical or strange. This is quite important. So refraining from attacking the trafficker, and we have a slide on the drama triangle that we will cover in a second. But this is really important because, again, by attacking the trafficker, we kind of fall into this persecutor role where the victim feels like they have no choice but to protect their trafficker, which again, we don't want. We don't want to push a victim in the corner and have them defend their trafficker and minimize the abuse. We kind of want to be that third person perspective and just kind of be curious about their experiences in order to get more information. And of course, refraining from asking why questions that would place the blame on victims. So, why didn't you run away from this guy sooner? We want to make sure that we're asking typically open-ended questions that just show that we're kind of curious about what happened rather than placing this blame on the victim of, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? You could kind of reframe it as, well, tell me about what happened when you tried to leave or if you tried to leave. We do advocate for a co-response model, and the research supports this. There's still a lot of research coming out on this model, but it's essentially a collaborative effort between police and mental health practitioners to respond to victim recovery. So theoretically, mental health practitioners will have had the trauma-informed and responsive training to adequately respond to victim. But of course, we advocate that law enforcement as well have that training and understanding when working with trafficking victims as well. Some of you might be familiar with trafficking diversion. So we won't really belabor this point. We do have some research that is currently under review that, we evaluated a youth trafficking diversion court in Hillsborough County, and we found that they can be very effective under certain conditions. Really, the aim of these courts, if you're not familiar, is to help facilitate trafficking exit, to prevent trafficking from recurring, to divert victims from the criminal justice system, and just to provide a collaborative, trauma-informed, integrated care kind of setting to respond to really distinct victim needs. They appear to be very effective, these multidisciplinary teams, when providers involved are working collaboratively and communicating openly. Collaborators and providers have a wide range of resources, which is why it's so important to network and to connect with other experts in the field. Participants are also actively involved in their treatment and understand the purpose of the program and the court proceedings. They understand what the objective is. Victims are not criminalized for their behaviors and can be their behaviors can be attributed to their exploitation. And of course, again, leveraging those relationships with survivor mentors is really crucial. And we have a ton of research to suggest how important those relationships are. I know a lot of us have been in the field for a long time, and we can kind of we know we can recognize like the red flag indicators of trauma bonding. We have the language to kind of explain it, but it's still always very confusing. Um, that, when we provide so many resources and we're doing everything according to the literature and the research and, to the best of our ability, and you still have clients that, are a little bit more resistant to treatment. And we'll kind of talk about that in a second. Okay, and it looks like about 47% are kind of so-so, about 10% don't feel maybe as confident to explain trauma bonding to someone, and 45% said yes. Yeah, it's difficult. I think there's still a lot of research coming out in terms of what we can do in the clinical side of things, because it's kind of easy to intellectualize things and to talk about it with other experts but when you actually put it into practice, I think is when you start to see how difficult it is to explain some of these things that don't, leave a physical imprint, right? Like you can explain physical abuse, or sexual abuse to somebody because that leaves an imprint. But when it comes to something like trauma bonding, where it's kind of intangible, that becomes very challenging to describe. So in this section, we're just kind of going to go through some potential resources, tips and tricks, technical skills that you might find helpful. We've kind of broken this up into phases. So phase one is screening, just as like how it sounds like. The aim here is to gather any critical information about the victim's situation. We've noticed some key questions that we're kind of looking for here. So what circumstances are we working with? Again, you're thinking about those force, fraud, and coercion elements. What is the victim currently experiencing? What past or ongoing trauma have they endured? Who is involved in their exploitation? How many people? What is their relationship to the trafficker or abuser? How long has the victim been connected to the trafficker or abuser? How committed are they to leaving their situation? We've also listed out some screening tools and resources to help guide the interview process, if this is something that your organization does, as again, you're kind of gathering information about your client's circumstances. Providers may also want to consider assessing other related experiences like mental health symptoms, trauma bonding, of course, ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, beyond trafficking. I know the clinic where I currently work at, we also assess for resiliency, to kind of show clients, this is kind of how trauma has impacted you. But we can also, it provides a good discussion regarding post-traumatic growth and how they can overcome a lot of these traumatic experiences. And of course, things like suicidal ideation in more severe cases. But really, the point here is to have some type of semi-structured or structured protocol for collecting critical information. And in this process, ideally, you're also building that rapport and trust with clients, assuming you have enough time to build that rapport. But of course, this is really important in order to meet the needs of the victims, to understand and contextualize their experiences, and to also make sure that you're tailoring the protocol to the scope and the practice of your organization. So for example, if your organization does not have the authority or capacity to carry out a full-blown comprehensive mental health assessment, be sure that you have a easy referral process to make sure that your clients are getting whatever services they require. A quick note here about screening tools, human trafficking identification tools. There's a difference between screening and assessment, and which one you use really just depends on the scope and practice of your organization. Screening tools are quick initial checks to flag potential victims. Assessments are more in-depth, they're comprehensive. They will give you more accurate and contextualized information about your client, but they do take a longer amount of time to complete because you're relying on collateral information above and beyond conversations with the victim. We've hyperlinked some screening tools as an assessments here. Caveat here, not all of them are psychometrically validated, which is, as you probably recognized, a huge issue in our field. Most are aiming to assess for sex trafficking, which again is another kind of gap in this research, right? We want to make sure that we're developing accurate and reliable measures that also assess for labor trafficking. But unfortunately, this is kind of where we're at this point in time. So if you're interested in adopting one or looking through some of these, we've already linked them here, though there are plenty more out there. Phase two is safety planning, which is critical. The aim here to ensure that victims have access to essential resources that facilitate their exit from trafficking or their abusers, and ensuring that we are securing safety. Some key questions to consider at this phase. Do they have access to basic necessities, food, shelter, medical care? I often use Maslow's hierarchy of needs with clients to kind of showcase that before we can even work on trauma bonding stuff, trauma processing, we need to make sure that they're getting access to basic needs to fulfill those physiological and safety needs. Does the victim have a safe family, friends, or service providers to contact in cases of emergencies? Do they have reliable transportation to actually access those services consistently over time? Do they have children? If so, are they in a safe environment? Do they have access to childcare? Do they have family members that they can take care of their kids while they're attending services? Are they ready to leave their situation? Is the victim assigned to a multidisciplinary team, which I believe is required for youth trafficking victims here in Florida? Does the victim qualify for participation in a diversion court? Do they feel comfortable attending those programs? Might they find it challenging to address some of those issues through some type of diversion court? What type of treatment would be most beneficial? Individual, family, substance use. Often we use a combination of all. And again, we've included some resources here that might be of use at this phase of safety planning. I do want to quickly shout out the BRIGHT project through the USF TIP Lab. If you don't know, BRIGHT is an online referral system or network that helps providers link victims to different services. So currently the BRIGHT network does offer confirmed or potentially trafficked adult victims of sex and labor trafficking to services, links them to services throughout the state of Florida. So some services that they are currently involved in the network include case management, daily needs, education, employment, healthcare, mental health, substance use, legal services, support networks, and transportation. So if you're a BRIGHT network provider, you can refer your clients out for services, but you can also receive referrals as well. So if anyone is interested in learning more about BRIGHT or joining BRIGHT, we've included the link here. You can read more about some of the work that they're doing and how to join if you're interested. So phase 3 is where treatment and intervention begins. Again, this might take a couple weeks, it might take a couple months, sometimes it takes years, depending on how those two other phases are going, right? Establishing safety. The aim here is to explore and process lived experience. And really for me, my goal with my clients is to empower them and take them through their victim status, transitioning from victim to survivor to lived experience expert. Because as Robin said, survivors really are the experts in all of this. Some key considerations, what are the mental health diagnoses, right? What trauma bonding indicators are observed? This will help inform treatment planning and really allow you to understand, okay, with what pace do we have to kind of take things? What kind of symptoms are we working on first? And also including patients in that process, right? Asking them, what do they want to work on first? How does the victim perceive themselves in the world around them post-trafficking? How does the victim perceive their relationship with the trafficker over time? Right, so you're kind of tracking how this changes over time. How does the victim define safety and stability for themselves? And what skills or strengths does the victim have or want to build? Sometimes as providers, we tend to hyper-focus on the negatives, so the trauma, the abuse, the violence, and I think sometimes undermine the positives. So leveraging clients' strengths, focusing on resiliency, trying to foster post-traumatic growth. All of that is really important because we can't be the ones solving our clients' problems. We need to empower them to teach them skills and make decisions for themselves and honoring those decisions as well. Again, we've listed some treatment and support resources here. If you're a mental health practitioner, you know that there's no shortage of manualized psychotherapeutic treatments out there, but if you're starting out and you're interested, this is kind of a good place to start. I really do think psychoeducation, as I mentioned earlier, should be like a key component of treatment, just because discussions surrounding trauma and trauma bonding, human trafficking, all of that language is so important for the client to learn. So regardless of what approach you take, and I've listed some out here, cognitive behavioral therapy, CPT, EMDR, all of these things that we use in the field. To me, it really doesn't matter. Whatever's kind of works. The only thing I will say is that it should involve some extent of psychoeducation. It should be trauma-informed, victim-centered, and again, leveraging those relationships with survivor mentors is key. I've noted, again, some types of interventions here that you might be interested in, you might be doing already. I also really recommend considering family or group-based therapy for improving those social supports. Again, this is crucial for things like family reunification if you have a client who has kids, or longer term recovery, and helping transition support beyond the life. So helping them recognize that there's healthy people beyond what they've been through, and people who have exploited them that can help support them and also relate to their experiences as well. There's a good explanation for victims' resistance for help or treatment. I think this is probably one of the most important points in this presentation. So again, regardless of what therapeutic technique you're taking, we always want to try to avoid the so-called drama triangle. So this model was first described by a psychiatrist called Stephen Cartman, who wanted to visualize how conflict is handled in dysfunctional relationships. And it involves three main roles: so the victim, the rescuer, and the persecutor. The trauma triangle is affected by if it's affected by the trauma bonding kind of process. We see a couple things happening. So first, the trafficking victim takes on the role of the rescuer. Specifically, they attempt to rescue or protect the abuser or trafficker in hope of gaining acceptance or meeting his expectations. The victim believes that by repeatedly trusting and protecting the trafficker or abuser through any means necessary, dysfunction within the relationship will change or end. And secondly, the trafficker takes on the role of the victim and tries to identify with the real victim by knowing exactly what the victim wants, thinks in part due to all the grooming that they've done. And what ends up happening is that the victim, again, feels a sense of loyalty and a need to protect the trafficker, irrespective of the abuse that they're enduring. So naturally, service providers, law enforcement believe that by playing the role of the rescuer, we will resolve this role confusion. But unfortunately, what happens is, again, we end up pushing a victim in the corner and we kind of slip into that persecutor role, especially when we haven't built that rapport or trust yet with the victim. But there's ways that we can kind of prevent victim resistance and avoid this drama triangle. So first, you must become, again, a sort of neutral third party that is just trying to understand what is happening. Also understand that victims will be dishonest and they will express contempt, or they will be aggressive. They won't be trusting of providing you with information or divulging information to you. And really, your job isn't to obtain the most accurate information from the victim, because often you won't get that solely from speaking with the victim, especially, again, if you haven't built that trust or rapport. So just managing expectations as providers is really important. And in this initial stages of building client trust and rapport, it also, again, helps to mimic some of the same language, reflecting thoughts and feelings, parroting some of the language that they're using. Again, if they're not willing to provide you with the trafficker's real name, just kind of roll with it. Whatever they give you, just roll with it. Validating difficult experiences based on how the victim reacts when sharing these experiences. So if the victim isn't shuddering or just when discussing all these horrible things, try to remain calm and collected and don't overreact to experiences we objectively know to be traumatic or abusive. So, of course, validate when you feel comfortable, and it's important to validate those experiences, but try not to overreact to experiences that perhaps the victim doesn't quite recognize as being traumatic, or perhaps is desensitized to a lot of the abuse. So again, it's so important not to attack the trafficker, because again, this will push the victim in a corner and kind of leave them no choice but defend them as a means of reducing some of the cognitive distance they have by remaining in an exploitative relationship. So it's a little bit complicated, but by avoiding this drama triangle, theoretically, we can gain better trust and rapport with victims. Again, helping the survivor stabilize. Again, we've included some key questions here. And again, we will share these PowerPoints with you so you can look through all of them. But again, I just want to point out that when it comes to working with victims of human trafficking, one of the most important elements is elements. And it really is so important to talk with clients and have an honest conversation with them about how often it is expected that relapse will happen in these cases. So just trying to help them understand throughout all of these phases that it's part of the healing process. It's not linear. It is often cyclical. And again, we've included some during that relapse phase to help prevent it or overcome it, and help patients or clients kind of jump back on the wagon and continue with their journeys. These are some technical skills that we've just summarized across the entirety of the PowerPoint. Again, we will share this with you so you can look at some specific examples. We've done the same here with how to validate, provide validations, but also gently challenge so as to not confront and then fall back into that drama triangle. So again, we've provided some specific examples if you work more on the clinical side of things with clients. And these are kind of just some narratives that we included with victims about how they kind of respond to treatment before the trauma bonds are broken, during, and after. But in the interest of time, I will kind of let you guys read these in your own time. These are my own narratives of my clients that I've worked with. And again, some things for the tip lab. If you're interested in looking at some things with the tip lab, if you want access to the trauma bonding scale for adults, I've linked our studies here for Reed 2023 and Cheneville 2024, and Dr. Reed's book, which you mentioned earlier.
This has been an amazing, wonderful, information filled, um, across the board look at this issue. So thank you both so much. So let's
Definitely.
take a few of the questions, and one of them really pertain to something we get asked all the time, which is a lot of the research has been done on sex trafficking. What about forced labor? What about labor trafficking? What about the realities of trauma bonding in a labor trafficking situation where sex trafficking is completely absent? Any thoughts on that?
I'll take that one. So I'm not trying to do a plug for my book. I promise I make like no money on it or anything. So it's an academic book. But we do cover that in a couple of the chapters that this isn't limited, like we've said to begin, this is not limited to sex trafficking or intimate partner violence or child sexual abuse. It really occurs whenever there's interpersonal conflict and violence and abuse. And so, of course, with labor trafficking, this is occurring also. There just hasn't been as much research done on labor trafficking. As researchers in the field, we need data. Data comes from the field, and so it's kind of this circular lack of data means there's a lack of research. But I will recommend that there is some research done in the UK around the county lines, gang abuse that went on, where people were abusing youth in order to coerce them into being drug runners for them. And there's some good research if you want to, look at that. I can maybe send some links to those articles. So there are some information that's beginning on forced criminality and within forced labor and labor trafficking. So that's a great question.
Thank you, thank you. The other thing is somebody asked how to turn off or turn down the fight or flight or freeze or fawn
Ooh.
response, and that was your entire last section of the presentation. So lots of information came in about that. Another question was really focused on trauma bonding inside a family. So a young child who is being trafficked by a family member. Is there research on that? And do you want to address that issue and that phenomenon of familial trafficking? I mean, I can't imagine there wouldn't be trauma bonding at that point.
Right. I mean, Cletus can also speak to this, but I think the what she shared about the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome really fits with that familiar trafficking and how the child will respond. I think if that article by Summit back in 1983 was on point. And so that may be something you could post because I'm sure it's, since 1983, it's got to be out there for free. I think that would, if there's any place where that theory and applies within human trafficking, it would be with familiar trafficking.
Mhm.
You agree,
Exactly.
Cletus?
Yeah, absolutely. And all of the references we have here, I've linked here. They're all accessible. They're all free. You can get them through Google Scholar if you're interested in reading up on some of the research that we cited throughout, including Summit's paper.
Great. Oh my gosh. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I think that is going to be all we have time for. I hope, so somebody, Michelle Connors asked, by chance, can you help shed light on why the national missing person stats for Florida differ from the tip lab numbers? That's going back to your tip report. Do you want to talk about that in the last 30 seconds we have here?
Um, So I'm not sure exactly what numbers you're referring to in the tip lab report. If you're discussing the victim survey, that was a separate anonymous online survey that we did within the state of Florida. So that would be very different. If there could and also a lot of people, I don't think we shared their data with us. We did reach out to many organizations, and we hope to include more of that information in the next annual report. So I think putting out that annual report, we got to have a lot of attention, and I think people will be more willing to share their data with us, and it'll become more robust in the future.
It is a great report. Thank you for doing it. And also just noting that I'm not sure what's in the national missing person stat, but not every missing person is trafficked too. So there's just how do we figure all this out? So everyone, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Clay, just thank you, Dr. Reed. This has been a rich, rich session. And know that too, we are not having a program in November. We are not having a program in because of a scheduling conflict. Congratulations to the Just in Time Training Network for getting an award during the time that we normally would hold this event. Congrats, congrats, well deserved. We will not be having a program in December because it is so close to the holidays when people are taking off. So everyone, we'll see you in January. We'll see you in 2026. So thank you to everyone who has participated with our program over the year. It's been amazing. I think we've trained. I mean, I'm going to guess, but we've probably trained over 2,000 people through our third Friday webinars, which is pretty amazing and gratifying. So thank you for participating and for your learning. We look forward to seeing you in 2026. Look at that. That's like an emoji that just came through. And thank you, University of South Florida, both for Dr. Reed's work and for Clagis's work and for what you've done at Just in Time for Us. Your generosity is amazing. We love you. And we'll see you in 2026, everyone. And if you haven't yet, sign up for the Stack newsletter. Go to surviveandthriveadvocacy.org. You'll be able to get this session, the PowerPoint, more information, and you'll find out what's happening in January. Okay, everyone. Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.